In every man there is a child that yearns to play. And the most attractive game is occultation, mystery. Man's maturity, to have regained the seriousness that he had as a child at play. One of the things that happens with the splitting of the star, let's forget about theology for a second. Let's forget about the abstract stuff. And let's just think about it from a psychological perspective, from an individual perspective. We all start when we're very young, in a certain sense, without a very strong sense of self. Our sense of self is very dispersed. We tend to be at one with things. Right? Like a little child, like when something upsets a little child, it's like earth-shattering. They flip the fuck out and scream as loud as they can. Just like when a little child is like happy and excited, it's just like their face just like, they're so overcome with joy at things. They are completely at one with their experience. And there's a kind of, and that's also the same thing, that's also the root of their spontaneity. You could think of the star as like that. But as time goes on, as a person develops, as they get older, they get into more trouble and life hits up against them and defines for them where the limits of their self are. It creates that split that we're talking about within the star, where self-consciousness eventually emerges. They learn limitation, in other words. It's the same thing. If the experiences that the child gets into, let's say, are particularly traumatic, they might reflect upon themselves or be thrown back on themselves in a way that they're not at all ready for, where they don't really have the resources within them to sort of cope with the situation. And the human spirit has this sort of, innate genius to it where it'll cope. And so these various defense mechanisms or walls will come up. And so what starts out in childhood as a kind of innate, ingenious form of self-protection and adaptation, as the person gets older and older, it becomes severe dysfunction after a while. And all sorts of problems arise. And that's how it'll end up in psychotherapy and so forth. But what you end up with is various walls around you. In a very rigid sense of, this is me, this is the border of where I am, and that's the rest of the world. And an inability to cope with that constant flux of change, which is really going on underneath. With the result that we can end up feeling quite dead and unnourished by life. Because we're not able to trust enough to create the openings to let that vitality come in and to begin to enliven us and let us feel that spontaneity. But one of the cool things about art is that it's a safe way to experience that energy coming in. So you see a particularly vibrant painting, or listening to really intense music at a rock concert where you're just surrounded by all this sensation, and that energy is allowed to sort of break through those walls, and so there's this feeling of existence and a feeling of being alive. Oneself is becoming alive and seeing something which is alive, and to the point where the next day it might feel like you have like almost a severe hangover just from how much sensation you experienced and how you're not used to experiencing it. So the question here is, how do you return to that sense of spontaneity that you had as a child, that you lost through these bad experiences? I say child broadly, it could apply to adolescence as well. You can't just simply walk right back into it and go directly into it. It just doesn't work that way. It's not life. How do you do it as an adult? Well, there's very little difference between a wise person and a fool, at least in how we tend to conceive of them, there's really only one exception to it. The wise person returns to the things of childhood, but with their eyes open, with a greater sense of capability. They're not naive anymore. They know what things are dangerous, but they're able to approach them anyway. They're able to muster the courage to have the trust necessary to approach reality with their eyes open. When we view art, we're getting some kind of sense of that. It's awakening that sense of spontaneity again within us, which we could enjoy more if we could have the courage and build up the trust and have the wisdom. In each poetic statement, chaos must shimmer through the veil of regular order. It's talking about poetry, but it's a similar thing. It's a window into something beyond these artificial walls that we've created around us, either through trauma or even just the normal process of growing up and coming across the old person to the job. Truth lives on in the illusion of art, and it is from this copy or after image that the original image will once again be restored. The after image of what? Well, you're seeing the after image of that initial connection that you once had, that sense of spontaneity, of aliveness that you've lost. And when it shows up in a particularly poignant way, it feels a little bit like an emergency. I mean, think of the last time, or think of one of the last times that you either finished a really good novel or maybe saw a particularly powerful film. You may have had the feeling immediately after, you may have had the thought of something like, wow, something has to change. Or something in my life has to change. But it wasn't clear what had to change. You didn't really know. Like, art is, I mean, unless it's like whatever, like a propaganda film, but like most art isn't going to tell you like, well, actually what you have to change is, you have to change X, Y, and Z. Or, you really ought to get a job, and, whatever. It's not like that. Art doesn't do that. It's really more like a feeling that it produces, not a particular like program inside your head. And there's this sense of urgency in it, but the urgency doesn't have to do with like you're gonna die or something. It's not an existential threat. Like, oh shit, an asteroid's gonna hit the Earth. I better build a bunker or something. It's not like that. Like, death isn't really a problem in and of itself. What's really the problem that's being raised is maybe that you haven't lived as much as you should have. If you're really living, death isn't going to be that much of a problem to you. Your own death, that is. The death of other people is different. But the real problems with death arise when it doesn't seem like you have truly been living at all. When you haven't been realizing something like the potential within yourself, which is a mystery and a sort of gift that you've been given, but that you're now squandering and wasting. That's the sense of urgency that's arising. And so these particular experiences, they're not they're not all aesthetic experiences, but the aesthetic ones are just particularly potent. It's like you're being called by something. You're being called through like a crack in the window, like of a wall that you didn't even know was there. And there's some message being sent, something's flickering, and you have to go toward it. You're being called. What are you being called toward? Well, I don't know, but it's something like living a life of meaning and purpose. It's living a life of doing your true will. A life of risk, but where it's worth it. That's why in beauty is eternal truth revealed. It's shining through. It's a part of the star or the self lighting up and saying, hey, over here. Have you ever wondered why the rainbow is the symbol of promise in Genesis? I mean, there's probably some spooky esoteric reason for it, but what occurred to me is because it's beautiful. That's the symbol of God's promise. Beauty is something like the image of the image of, I mean, to put it in a really sort of facile way, of just a better future. A future where you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And therefore you are, again, at home in the world. And spontaneous. But awake. Awake. Eyes open. That's the difference.